All right, so let's dive deep into HyperScale software and our appliance. So quick question, have you guys had a chance to, I know some of you have, had a chance to dive deep into some of the things that we're doing here around HyperScale? I'm assuming that most of you guys have kind of seen the scale-out technologies, some of the new players that have kind of started up in the valley, and where this is starting to drive disruption and change and backup. I mean, if you guys haven't heard about it, I'm sure there'd be a,
We've been to several of those vendors.
Awesome, great. So the whole idea here from a Commvault perspective, and this isn't a response, this is really as we were seeing this disruption occurring, we were also working and thinking of how we could also evolve what we are as a company to meet those different needs. And it's ultimately been, we've been looking at how we've developed our software for our customers and how do we evolve and help them better make use of those secondary storage copies. It was an idea that we really started back around the turn of the decade. And it just took us some time as we were reworking and innovating and changing the ways that we can work with our different customer systems. And so kind of as we went through that change, where we basically stand today is truly having an open system, an open platform that allows us to have a number of different APIs, some REST-driven, that allows customers to start to leverage and orchestrate different components of what's stored or what's inside of this platform and start using them for different use cases. It could even be non-Commvault backup use cases that this actual platform can be leveraged for. The interesting thing now is that opens up a whole slew new of ideas of how our data platform can be leveraged from a business in a business IT space. So that's where we've shifted. We've gone away from silos of just backup and archive, or backup and archive and search, or trying to make things really easy for how we tie workflows across the different data sets, and truly start to open up multiple layers within our software so that we can truly provide proper data services back to our customers. And that ultimately means it makes it easier for our customers to drive digital transformation. Yes, sir?
Just wanted to ask you a question on the previous slide.
Yeah, sure.
So when you talk about that evolution and then you talk about the layers and the components, I always get the feeling when I see that chart on the right that I've now got this huge, enormous beast that I've got to look after, which is feeding data in and having to maintain it and refresh it, and I can access it through APIs, and it sounds like it's taking over as much effort as the actual applications that I'm managing. How can that be divided up into something where I can consume it more easily, or is it already like that? Because I don't get that impression when I see what you're putting.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually a perception that this transformation, that we're fighting with this whole transformation too, because a lot of people think of Commvault as, man, they can absolutely support you and get your needs, but it's not the easiest thing to work with. And I think what you guys will see here through some of our demonstrations, so to your point, it's all of the orchestration layer that we have here is what helps simplify this. When you talk to our developers, their number one goal when they think of technologies, once they get through the, okay, yep, it's working and meeting the outcome we want, is now how do we automate any of those different manual processes or anything that would involve someone to get involved to make us get from point A to point B? And then more importantly, once we have those things solved, how do we then redefine how a customer can consume a package or a set of software features where they don't have to necessarily buy the whole entire platform for everything?
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you talked about a couple of other vendors at the very beginning of this section. One of the things they're selling their products on is the fact that it doesn't have to be put in by somebody who's a backup expert. It could be somebody who's doing that as part of their work, and therefore you've changed the process that goes on in that organization. So
you got it. I'm glad you brought that up, because we'll absolutely double click on how HyperScale helps us also change how you can take something as enterprise. Essentially, we've taken the ability to install and implement the platform in a matter of minutes and have you up and running in hardware that all you have to do is rack and stack, hit a couple of question answers as it actually starts to run its automated install, and you're up and running. And we'll showcase some of that. We don't have a demo of that today, but you will see on our show floor, we've got the appliance that you can look, see, feel, and touch. And like Bill said earlier, there'll be a number of things that you can look at and also interact with to kind of see the value of the appliance itself.
So the appliance is effectively, it's secondary storage, HyperScale,
Absolutely.
Scale out.
You got it.
And the access is REST API kind of thing. So you're accessing it as an object storage device, or?
So you can. It is essentially, think of it this way. So you've got Commvault, which, as you guys have probably known, can write to any disk. NAS, spinning disk, direct attach, you name it. And we would deduplicate software onto it, and you're off and running. Well, what essentially HyperScale is it's our ability to take that commodity server gear with internal storage, software define the storage layer, the volume management, the replacement of different devices, different nodes, and allow you to now scale out by adding new nodes for more capacity, more performance in a linear fashion. So it's not necessarily changing it to object storage. That's all part of the platform. how we can write to different data, or how we can even make ourselves look like an object storage interface, because we can do that as part of our APIs. It's about then the actual underlying infrastructure, how it scales out to meet the needs of the data set itself. And that also helps to solve some of the massive recovery needs that you might have, right? So if you've got 9 servers with different NICs to production networks, you can push a whole lot more data out that direction than if you've got one that's just super deep in storage. And that's the difference between the way web scale out, and the scale up.
So I'm trying to understand, so if I'm backing up an Oracle database, for instance, in the solution, and I ended up with an Oracle database at this HyperScaler device, what sort of access do I have? I mean, is it through API, through REST?
So you could have access through that through a number of ways. You could get access through kind of a REST API for how you want to recover and mount that information back. That's using a set of our live tools. And we'll actually talk about that in the active copy management side. You could access that information through your typical Commvault route of, I want to restore this to point B. You'd have access to that through, if it's also based off of snapshots, to do an instant mount of that information. Again, we'll talk about all those different configurations and how we make that happen. HyperScale is just the underlying platform that if you've made the secondary copy, we can leverage that now as either the source or the source for the copy back for how you're going to make those copies really accessible.
Okay.
Does that make more sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Do you anticipate data moving from object storage in the cloud to this secondary storage? Because it seems that there's a variety of different storage platforms that think, what people go into, Glacier or whatever, and they find, oops, it was the wrong place for it. It's going to cost a lot to deal with it there. Or the economics of what they find for S3 don't work for them. Do you see a use case of data coming from the public cloud back into HyperScale?
So I think the biggest scenario that might happen is, to your point, where the customer makes a mistake, where they've done something without maybe the full scale of awareness or really, where they're sending their data, and they get burned by not realizing the speed or the access, or they haven't fully thought through how that might impact their environment. I don't think you're going to see, if a customer's truly thought out how they're using, say, S3 from Amazon or Azure Blob or even the Google Cloud Platform for object storage, if they're starting to integrate into those different components, and they're thinking about why they're storing data there, I'm not necessarily sure, unless they have an instant need to have local, fast nearline availability of data, I don't see any reason why they might be taking it back from being in the cloud back on premises. Because ultimately, too, what our goal is from a Commvault perspective with our orchestration layer is, if a customer moves data to the cloud, let's help them keep it in the cloud from here on out. Let's never worry about bringing it back on premise. Let's make it easy to provision the actual workloads you need in that elastic environment. Make it easy to promote from one level of storage to the next. And that's kind of the whole idea of how we look at it with a customer for that use case. I don't really see them as saying, I want to move everything that's on the cloud back on-prem.
There is one scenario. They could decide that they could build an object storage platform in-house cheaper than they could buy it from the cloud. And then they could move it back. But that's not moving it into your platform per se.
Well, it could.
That's moving it back to a storage that you support.
Yeah, and the point from our perspective, it could, because we do, like I said, we have an S3 object interface that's built into how we store information.
Yeah,
So-
but Chris's critical word was cheaper. You're not aiming to be the lowest common denominator on storage costs in the S3 Glacier.
And I wasn't implying that it was a Commvault option to do that. That another vendor might give you that.
But his response was, sure, we can do that. And since the critical term here is price, right?
It all comes down to use case at that point and what you need out of it. If it's just archive or long-term storage, you probably have an argument. If you need to do something more than that, I think that's where some of the value and the flexibility and the agility makes sense.
My problem is, we've been talking about this and we haven't defined it. You have an appliance.
have to get there.
We don't know what that appliance does.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested to see how.
We need, here it is, it does this, we built a scale-out storage, and it has these interfaces, and this percentage of the machines have media servers. We need to understand what it is we're talking about.
I'm glad you asked.
Before we can get to the
the next slide.
abstract stuff we're talking about.
I'm glad you asked. So that actually leads us to the next conversation point then, right? What is HyperScale? I think you guys have had a chance to read this as we've been going back and forth. Let's just kick on. At the end of the day, this is all about providing software-defined architecture across commodities, server, and storage gear, applying that sort of software definition of scale out, how the storage is utilized, applying things like erasure coding so that you can basically scale horizontally. And this goes back to the the cattle versus pet sort of conversation. If something goes wrong, get rid of it, replace it. Don't worry about doing, array rebuilds and providing that level of resiliency that's required with today's new dense storage types. The way we do that then, and of course, we end up taking, I guess before we talk about the way we do that, we end up taking the idea of OS patches, the security firewall system, the operating system, the Commvault software, the storage networking, the servers, and basically combining that all together and being managed as a part of the actual hyperscale level. So we manage then with what's the media servers, what are the data services, what storage is being utilized, how's data being handled, stored, et cetera. We end up taking that and simplifying that down. So it's just data, HyperScale helping to simplify all those middle layers, and basically working on what is the standard server hardware and their networking. Okay? We break that down to what that means. There's really two major implementation choices, and then we'll get into the details here, right? We work with reference architectures with a number of different server vendors. So that's basically any third-party vendor from an HP to a Cisco to a Lenovo, Supermicro, you name it, right? And even allowing customers to pick and choose based on a validated design on what they want to actually build this scale-out infrastructure from. We've also built our own appliance. And our own appliance basically provides that all-in-one implementation of the same scale-out infrastructure, so they can continue to add nodes and grow based upon their storage needs and their actual compute and secondary copy requirements. So what that is actually, before we go into the actual details, the way we actually focus these offerings then, the server reference architecture, it's designed for the primary multi-petabyte scale. So when we go into the details of this, it's using Red Hat and Red Hat Gluster for every single server. So every server that lives in this node is a media agent. It can do data services. Every server that lives in this node does storage services. And it all works together in a scale-out file system using Red Hat Gluster that integrates kind of that foundation of how we're providing that scale-out service. On the reference architecture side, we've worked with Cisco, as Bill mentioned earlier, to announce a solution called Scale Protect with Cisco UCS. And what that is essentially is a reference architecture design on Cisco UCS that's on their price book. It's a product that is basically built Commvault Cisco together to give customers this data protection solution on the scale-out infrastructure. On the flip side, our HyperScale appliance, it's that pre-designed integrated appliance, and it's meant more for a smaller level environment, not looking for multi-massive petabyte scale. And we'll go into the details of Gluster and whatnot here in a moment. The reference design program, you guys can look at these as we kind of go through it, but the ultimate piece here is that when you enter our reference design program, we are validating configurations. So the basis, SAS controllers, the networking cards, making sure everything works properly with the hardened ISOs that we load and go with, making sure that the customer doesn't have a problem when they first launch the actual software itself. And you see the current partners that we have, and we'll continue to work with future ones. And we'll even let partners, our partner ecosystem and our customer ecosystem, to nominate vendors they want to work with that are not on this list if it's their preferred vendor of choice. It also gives us some good global flexibility as you go into different parts of the world where maybe HP or Fujitsu or Cisco isn't the mainstay.
So one of the selling points for this is that Red Hat file system underneath, which is really nice because it helps with validation of hardware. Red Hat does a really great job of validating hardware. When I put this in my data center and my security team scans against these boxes, they're going to see a Red Hat OS.
Correct.
How do you guys handle patch management when it comes to I like to treat this as an appliance, meaning I can normally push my security team away saying, hey, you know what, this is a storage appliance. It doesn't fall in line with our regular Red Hat patching policy. The security team is going to say, that's Red Hat patching.
Correct. And so those patches today are rolled in as a part of our software deployment. So as patches come forward, we also roll those out as Commvault service packs, Commvault hotfixes, et cetera, that they can get access to the auto download to attach to those environments. I don't know, Jonathan, do you have anything else to add on that? Yeah, so basically we're working with Red Hat as we understand what comes through critical changes, what is just functional, I guess recommended patching levels or whatnot. We roll that as a part of our service pack as we get our customers.
So you guys have produced CVEs and all that separate from Red Hat in conjunction with Red Hat, but the storage team, whoever's managing this box will get CVEs so they can set up in their cadence of reviewing patches and criticality when it comes to security, impact to the organization. You guys are pretty much locked in step with Red Hat.
Yeah, by standardizing with that, it gives us that ability that when those critical patches and when those critical infrastructure conversations comes down and when they're reported by Red Hat, they're streamlined as part of our software distribution in play. So we can basically, we didn't want to reinvent that wheel too. We figured that Red Hat was a very good enterprise level operating system, trusted by a number of enterprise todays, and especially with Gluster and its scalability, it allowed us to kind of dovetail that conversation in very quickly to basically not necessarily sidestep, but partner with Red Hat to add a little bit of that credence and credibility.
And with Linux as the foundation, can I use the same automation tools for deploying those patches onto that platform without impacting data services?
Yes, yeah, it's part of that same framework.
Yeah, it's all the Commvault patching and automated downloads that pulls all of that and deploys it.
Actually, I do have a question on Keith's note. How quickly internally have you developed any sort of SLAs for when, let's say, an emergency patch comes out for security on Red Hat to get it out into your platform?
I'll have to go back to support on that one, but we're basically aligning the severity levels on, we have our severity levels for obviously our internal patches. That falls into our hotfix capabilities. That can be, depending on the software settings that you choose inside of Commvault, already either pre-staged download or automatically applied. We're following the same components and we're trying to basically match the SLA levels of Red Hat. There's obviously going to be a slight delay from it's been out, it's processed in our center. We're trying to do an immediate quick Q&A on that component to turn it out immediately, to then make sure that obviously with the criticality of our platform, we don't want it to go down by blindly patching. So there is a slight delay, but I can take that as a takeaway and find out from our support level if we have that dealt.
What's that gap? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. It's not something that's lost on us, though. They're working through those final.
So is there any Red Hat virtualization in this appliance at all, or?
So there, in the appliance, there is. In the reference architecture to designs, there's not. That's the one small difference between the two. And that only reason is because the virtualization allows us to run a highly available comm server, our management server, that can basically float through all the different nodes. And so I'll touch on that here in a second.
So you're running what I'm going to continue to call Sympana because your current name is
Commvault Software.
completely meaningless and useless. So I'm going to run, so the appliance runs RHEL and Gluster and Sympana on top of that. What interfaces to Gluster are you exposing? CIFS, and excuse me, Stephen, SMB, NFS, S3, what are my choices?
Go ahead.
Because you're pitching this now as secondary storage, not just backup.
Yes and no. So one of the think of Gluster to us as our internal scale-out infrastructure. What we want to be careful with is the components of the data tagging, the analytics components, the metadata and deduplication, compression, encryption, all the components that we can add on top of it. So
Right.
Gluster itself isn't directly exposed as one of the interfaces, although it can be with NFS. The NFS layer that we expand is ours, so then we can inline
Okay,
do
so
duplication
it's
and
through
compression.
us. So it's
and then
NFS
through us.
through Sympana.
Right. So therefore, if
Sympana.
a customer wanted to take an inbound data ingestion through one of our agents and then present that out through another interface, Commvault has to have knowledge of that entire data path.
Okay.
If we were just to expose Gluster, we'd lose that intelligence.
Yeah, but that means that the Commvault, generally the Commvault software is the data mover.
Correct.
And you were talking earlier about this being secondary storage for other applications.
Correct.
So-
We'll talk a little bit about that today on how we can use our APIs to allow them to store to it.
You're trying to work out
I'm
where the
getting you
endpoint is.
can
to
and
the-
you can't both.
Yeah.
Can't go right.
I'm
across.
getting,
No.
no,
So
if
Commvault has the API layer to open up an NFS or an S3 conversation with the storage, that's still communicating with Commvault to do the translation that then stores it to the underlying Gluster file system.
So Commvault is basically acting as a, Commvault is in a data path and you're interfacing with that API.
Commvault-
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So-
You're not natively going straight to Gluster. You're still
That's-
going through our services.
but I'm going through your services without using you as the data mover.
Without necessarily using an agent to get you there, yes.
Correct.
Commvault exposes an NFS
Okay,
linkage that you
and
can
that's
hit directly.
NFS and S3?
Yes.
NFS, S3, and there's a few others as well. We can get you that full list if you want.
SMB?
SMB is not on that list today.
No, not
We're
on that
working
list
through-
today.
We're working on SIFs, but SMB is not one of those.
Yeah,
SIFs
if
is-
it does S3, I don't care that it does Swift.
Shouldn't be doing SIFs, but SMB.
you know, as an API, S3 is one.